The light rain fell on the iron gate, each drop counting down the seconds until her departure. Her suitcase, worn and small, was already in the trunk of the taxi, and the wet road reflected the mansion's golden lights for the last time. There was no more room to turn back, or so she thought. The millionaire, standing in the doorway, watched her with that silent gaze that never gave anything away. And then, as her hand reached for the car door handle, he said something that made the air around her heavy and her heart stop. A simple sentence without shouts or pleas, but charged with something that permeated years of secrets, guilt, and unspoken memories. It was enough for her to take a step back instead of getting into the car. The driver waited, confused, as she stood motionless in the rain, trying to grasp the weight of those words. The millionaire didn't move, just stared at her, as if he already knew what her decision would be. The cold night wind brought the scent of wet earth mixed with his perfume, and suddenly everything she swore to leave behind came rushing back. The silent corridors, the closed doors, the looks that never explained anything. His words echoed in her head, each repetition growing heavier, as if they had been written for her long before they were spoken. The taxi cut the engine. The gate, once a barrier, now seemed like an invitation, and without realizing it, she was already walking back, her steps slow, feeling as if she had just crossed the border into something that would change her life forever. If this story has kept you hooked so far, leave a like and subscribe to the channel right now. The wet road reflected the mansion's warm lights like a broken mirror, distorting them until they seemed to come from another time. The taxi waited with its engine running, its low, steady rumble mingling with the sound of the light rain. She clutched her bag tightly, as if its weight were enough to tear her away. Her hands were cold, but her heart burned with the decision she had made hours before. There was no longer any way to live within walls that held secrets heavier than any silence. The iron gate stood open, and the dark night seemed to invite her forward. Each step she took on the wet gravel was a silent farewell to something that deep down had never been hers. When she crossed the threshold, she saw him standing there, imposing and immobile, as if time itself had decided to wait to see her leave. He didn't say anything right. Away. He just watched, and that look carried more weight than any words could. She looked away, pretending not to notice, because she was tired of being drawn in by looks that never explained anything. As she reached the taxi, her hand touched the doorknob. The driver, a middle-aged man with a neutral expression, cast a quick glance in the rearview mirror. Then, behind her, like a blade cutting through the night, came the sentence. Just 7 words, without a shout, without urgency, but charged with something that changed the air's temperature. The world seemed to slow down, and the sound of rain became a distant backdrop. She stood still, her hand still on the doorknob, as the sentence repeated itself in her mind, like a stubborn echo. It wasn't a plea, it wasn't a lament, it was a call that knew her name even before she was born. The driver cleared his throat impatiently, but she didn't hear. Her fingers loosened their grip on the cold metal of the door, and without realizing she took a step back. The gate, which had once seemed like the final exit, now became a border inviting surrender. She felt each drop of rain on her face as if it were a warning. When she looked back at him, he was still there, his body erect, his eyes steady, and the certainty that each step she took back would be into something she could never control. But still, she went. One step, then another, and with each step, she felt herself moving away from the known world and plunging into a realm where the rules were already written, and none of them were in her favor. The driver turned off the engine without her asking. The sound of the rain on the hood grew louder, almost a cold applause for the decision she wasn't yet sure she was making. Each step back felt heavier than the last, as if the floor of the entryway recognized her weight and wanted to keep her there forever. As she approached, she realized he hadn't moved an inch since he'd spoken those words. His gaze remained steady, unhurried, as if he knew he didn't need to repeat himself. When he finally reached the threshold, he broke the silence with a tiny gesture. He held out his hand for her to hand over her suitcase. She hesitated. She felt the cool leather of the handle against her palm, but his gesture wasn't one of possession. It was one of control. Dropping that suitcase was like signing something invisible, acknowledging that he was giving up a piece of the freedom he'd just won. He didn't force it. He simply held his hand out until, without realizing it, she gave in. The suitcase disappeared from her sight as he handed it to an employee who appeared and vanished with the precision of someone trained to leave no trace. "You think you know everything that happened here," he said finally, his voice low but laden with something that felt both menace and promise. "But you haven't heard the whole story yet." The sentence, so simple, held a strange weight, as if it were a key. And a key, she knew, doesn't exist without a door, and doors in that house were never left open for nothing. They walked through the hall in silence. The marble floor reflected soft light from antique chandeliers, and the sound of their footsteps echoed like a church aisle. She noticed the side doors were closed, as if the house had prepared to solemnly welcome her back. He opened the office door and motioned her in. Inside, the air was warmer, filled with the scent of polished wood and a faint hint of tobacco. On the desk sat a rectangular dark wooden box with a gold clasp. Without a word, he opened the box and revealed a single, precisely folded sheet of paper. He pushed it toward her. Unfolding it, she saw a handwritten letter in ancient script. The words were short but direct. "If she returns, show her the truth." There was no signature, just a date she knew, but one that made no sense. It was the day, years ago, when her mother had disappeared without a trace. Her heart pounded. She tried to ask, but he held up his hand, signaling silence. "There are things you think you couldn't bear to hear, but if you leave now, you'll only carry the lighter half of the story, and the lighter half still weighs enough to crush you." He stood, walked over to a bookshelf, and pulled out a thick, leather-bound book. Behind it, a small iron door became visible. "If you decide to stay, you'll open this. But once you open it, there's no going back." Her breath caught in her chest. She couldn't tell if it was curiosity or fear that kept her there. He said nothing more, just handed over the door key and walked away, as if the decision had already been made. She closed her hand around the key, feeling the cold metal as if it were part of a ritual she hadn't chosen. The small iron door seemed at odds with the rest of the office, not because of its color, but because of its lack of ornamentation. While the house exuded luxury and ostentation in every detail, this door was bare, raw, as if it simply served the purpose of keeping things safe. The millionaire stepped away, stopping by the window, and turned his face away so she couldn't see his expression. There was no rush in his gestures. The urgency was all there. The footsteps toward the door echoed loudly for such a small space, as if the sound were multiplying. The lock accepted the key easily, but turning it required strength. The mechanism gave way with a dry click, and an ancient smell escaped, a mixture of aged paper and iron. Inside there was no gold or jewelry, just a wide wooden drawer, its corners darkened by time. Pulling it out was like breaking an invisible seal. Inside, he found 3 objects. The first was an old photograph of a young woman, smiling shyly, wearing a simple dress but with one detail impossible to ignore: the ruby necklace. The second was a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon, each envelope addressed to the same person, the millionaire. And the third, the strangest, was a small black box with a delicate clasp. Upon opening it, he found a pair of earrings with smaller rubies, identical to those in the photo. She looked up at him, but the millionaire didn't turn. "What is this?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. He took a while to answer, and when he did, the words came as a slow slam. "These are the missing pieces to complete the whole, and you are the final piece." The weight of the sentence fell on her like a door closing behind her. It wasn't a vague metaphor. Something in his tone suggested a cruel logic behind it. She picked up one of the letters and saw the delicate handwriting of the same woman from the photograph. She opened it carelessly and read a few lines. They were farewell letters, not of love, but of warning. A warning about the house, about him, about a pact that could never be broken. The last lines were a plea. "If I don't come back, don't let him choose another." The air in the office seemed thicker, and she realized her hand was still holding the photograph. The woman's face held something familiar but not in the features, in the look. A reflection of herself, but older, more tired. The millionaire then approached, took the photo from her hands, and put it away again, locking the iron door. "Now you understand why you can't leave," he said calmly. "Not after knowing this." She took a step back. She didn't want to understand, but she already did. And deep down, she knew that, even without wanting to, she was already trapped in. Whatever that story meant. She spent the night awake, sitting on the edge of her bed, the sound of the light rain tapping against the window like a slow metronome for thoughts she didn't want to have. The woman's face in the photograph wouldn't leave her mind, and the worst part was that the resemblance wasn't just in her features, it was in the way she held the necklace, in the way she looked into the camera as if she knew the image would outlive her. When morning came, he went down to the kitchen. Mrs. Doyle, the housekeeper, was making coffee and gave him a quick yet fraught look. There was no surprise on her face, just the silent confirmation that she already knew. "He showed me the door, didn't he?" she said, without waiting for an answer. The cup clinked on its saucer. "That's how it starts for everyone, all of them." The word stuck in her mind like a nagging echo. She tried to make conversation, but Mrs. Doyle closed herself off again, just pushing the cup toward her and leaving through the side door. During the day, she tried to keep busy. She cleaned the rooms that were rarely used, dusted bookshelves filled with books that looked like they'd never been opened. But in every corner of the house, she found a detail that seemed to whisper of that other woman's presence. A handkerchief forgotten at the bottom of a drawer, an old perfume still lingering in the wood of a cabinet, a yellowed note hidden between the pages of a novel. Late in the afternoon, she found herself standing before the portrait in the dining room. It was imposing, gilded, and showed the woman in the photo wearing the necklace and earrings she'd seen in the black box. There was something unsettling about the painting. It seemed more alive than any portrait should be. The eyes seemed to follow her around the room. The millionaire entered silently, standing behind her. "Beautiful, isn't she?" he said, his voice carrying a strange cadence, as if it were both a compliment and a tease. She didn't respond. He stepped forward, placing himself beside her, and added, "Do you know why she stayed even after she wanted to leave?" The question was a trap, but before she could answer, he gave her the answer himself. "Because there were things only she could hold, and now only you can." The sentence fell between them like a weight, and she felt the air in the room grow colder. She looked back at the portrait and felt the woman's eyes flicker, not obviously, but as if they were flickering. Inside her mind, he walked away slowly, leaving her alone with the painting. In the silence that followed, she heard a faint sound behind the wall, as if someone was scratching the wood from the inside out. When he returned to his room that night, he found the ruby necklace on the bed. It hadn't been there when he left, and next to it a short note, written in the same handwriting as the old letter, "Use it." That's how it starts. She stood in the bedroom doorway, watching the necklace on the bed, as if it were a living, breathing animal. The golden chain reflected the soft light from the lamp, and the rubies seemed to pulse with an inner glow, almost breathing. The note lay nearby, and the simplicity of the words, "Use it, that's how it starts," had a weight that no long sentence could carry. She walked slowly to the bed, feeling the carpet cushion her every step. She sat on the edge but didn't immediately touch the necklace. The memory of the photograph, the letters, the portrait, and the sound behind the wall mingled like a tight bundle in her mind. She glanced at the mirror in the corner of the room and realized uncomfortably that the reflection seemed darker than the actual room. The frame, previously neutral, now seemed to hold something she was waiting for. When he finally reached out, his fingers hesitated over the rubies. The cold of the metal ran across his skin like a shiver that didn't originate from his body. As he lifted it, he felt its unexpected weight. Heavier than a piece of jewelry should be, as if it were carrying something more than gold and stone. He lifted it to his neck. The zipper clicked shut with a soft click, but the sound echoed through the room almost exaggeratedly. The instant the necklace touched his skin, a wave of images rushed through his mind, flashes of the mansion with different furniture, people dressed in clothes from another era, muffled laughter, a piano playing by itself, and, for an instant, the touch of a female hand on his shoulder, firm but not hostile. She left the room with uncertain steps, descending the stairs as if being pulled. She found the millionaire in the dining room, sitting at the head of the table, looking at her with restrained satisfaction. "Now you're ready to hear the rest," he said, patting the arm of the chair to her right. She sat down and noticed that the portrait in front of her seemed sharper, more recent, as if someone had touched up the painting at the last minute. During dinner, he said little, but his words were laden with double meaning. There are pieces that don't move by themselves. You need someone willing to occupy them and support the weight. She understood he wasn't just talking about the necklace. As the hall clock struck midnight, the candlelight flickered. For a second, the woman in the portrait seemed to smile, a short, almost imperceptible smile, but impossible to ignore. Returning to her room, she tried to remove the necklace, but the clasp felt different, as if it weren't the same one she'd put on. There was no looseness, no click, just the feeling that the chain no longer depended on her to stay there. The next morning she woke with the strange certainty that she hadn't slept alone. It wasn't just the weight of the necklace against her skin, but the distinct sensation that a presence shared the same space. Silent, attentive, almost protective, but with a purpose she didn't understand. When she got up, she noticed that the necklace was slightly warmer, as if it had absorbed human heat during the night. She went to the mirror. The face was hers, but the eyes held a different glow, firmer, almost haughty. And it didn't come from within. It was as if someone else were watching her from behind that reflection. She turned quickly, a little startled, but the room was empty. Still, the feeling lingered. She went down to breakfast and found Mrs. Doyle setting the table. The housekeeper glanced at the necklace and sighed, looking away as if she'd seen it before and didn't want to repeat the conversation. "He shouldn't have given it to you so soon," she murmured. The sentence, spoken almost as if to herself, kept resonating in her mind. The millionaire appeared a few minutes later, impeccably dressed in a dark suit, and sat down without saying good morning. He simply observed. It wasn't a look of approval or disapproval, but of assessment, as if gauging the extent of the necklace's effect. "Today I want you to accompany me to the piano room," he said, in a tone that brooked no question. The room, closed for weeks, was filled with the smell of aged wood and ancient perfume. The piano, black and shiny despite its age, occupied the center, and above it hung a silver photo frame. Inside, the same woman from the painting, but from a different angle, sat at the piano, wearing the necklace. The photograph seemed too recent to belong to the past he spoke of. "She played every night," he said, as if it were a fond memory, "and she never missed a note." He approached, placed his hand on the piano, and with a gentle touch struck a key. The sound echoed longer than it should have, as if sustained by something invisible. She felt the central ruby of the necklace pulse in time. When she looked at her reflection in the living room mirror, she froze. The reflection showed the piano, the millionaire, and her, but in place of her own body, she saw the woman from the photo, wearing the same dress and earrings. Stored in the black box, she blinked and the image returned to normal. He noticed her reaction but didn't comment. He just walked over and, almost as if delivering a message, said, "The house knows who's ready, and so does she." That night, as she tried to sleep, the sound of a piano began to fill the air, even though no one was downstairs. The necklace warmed, and the next moment she felt a light touch on her shoulder. Not cold, but human. She turned quickly, and no one was there. But the ruby glowed brightly, as if it had just been kissed by the light of an invisible candle. That morning he woke before the sun, unsure if he had actually slept or simply drifted through hours of wakefulness, with his eyes closed. The necklace seemed more fitted to his neck, as if the chain had molded to the curve of his skin. As he descended the stairs, he noticed something he had never noticed before. The dining room curtains were open, revealing a shaft of grey light shining directly onto the portrait. And there in that light the woman looked different, more vivid, more alive, her eyes almost wet, as if waiting for someone to call her name. The millionaire sat at the table, not eating. He merely slowly turned a coffee cup between his fingers, his gaze fixed on it. "Today we're going to walk through the east wing," he said, as if announcing a test. That part of the house was always closed, and even Mrs. Doyle avoided it. As they walked, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Every closed door seemed to contain a pair of invisible eyes, every rug muffled footsteps that weren't just theirs. They stopped before a pair of dark, unadorned wooden double doors. He turned the handle and pushed slowly. Inside, a spacious but unfurnished room. Only the echo of footsteps and the scent of lavender mixed with ancient dust. In the center, an unlit chandelier hung, and beneath it, on the floor, an imperfect circle etched in the dust, as if someone had walked there repeatedly, always following the same path. She came here every night, he said, and he didn't need to explain who he was talking about. It was the only place she felt free, and in the end, it was here that she made the decision that changed everything. The words fell in the air as if they had their own weight. She took a few steps inside, and the moment she crossed the circle on the floor, she felt her necklace heat up and the air thin, as if the room were different. Suddenly, the room was no longer empty. The chandelier was on, music was playing in the background, the woman was walking in a silk dress, and the necklace was glowing like fire. The scene lasted seconds, but it was enough to make her heart race. When she blinked, everything returned to dust and silence, but the millionaire watched her as if he knew she had seen him. "The necklace doesn't reveal anything that doesn't need to be seen," he said, before closing the door. That night, she dreamed of the ballroom, but in the dream, she wasn't observing. She was in the scene, feeling the weight of the dress, the touch of the ruby on her skin, and the same mix of courage and desperation she'd seen in the woman's eyes. She woke with the certainty that it wasn't just a dream. It was a memory. When she looked in the mirror, she noticed her gestures were changing, the way she tied her hair, the way she sat, even the way she held her cutlery at dinner. They were hers, and they weren't. The next morning, upon waking, it took her a few seconds to remember she was in the present. It felt like she'd spent an entire night living another life, a life that knew the mansion better than she ever could have. He knew where every floorboard creaked, where the sunlight entered first, where the scent of lavender was strongest. And most disturbingly, he even knew the exact order of the drawers in the millionaire's desk, as if he'd opened them hundreds of times. When she went down to breakfast, she found Mrs. Doyle waiting, standing by, the door with a worried expression. "You're getting awfully pale," she remarked, but her tone seemed less of concern and more of observation. "The necklace has already started doing what it always does." Before she could ask what that meant, the housekeeper walked away as if she'd said more than she should have. The millionaire, meanwhile, was sitting at the head of the table, leafing through a newspaper, but not reading. He merely turned the pages mechanically, his gaze flicking toward her. Every now and then, as if measuring the progress of something invisible. "You look different," he said suddenly. "Even your walk has changed." There was no compliment in the sentence, just a cold analysis. That afternoon, while tidying one of the closed rooms, he found an antique shoebox at the back of a closet. Inside were a pair of silk gloves, already yellowed with age, and a sepia photograph. The woman in the portrait, younger, sitting in the same circular room she had visited with him, her, gloved hands in her lap. On the back of the photo, a scrawled phrase, "So that we never forget where it began." As soon as she read it, a wave of images washed over her, not flashes, but full memories. She was standing in the ballroom, with music and guests, and the much younger millionaire was watching her from the corner, his possessive gaze sweeping across the room. She felt the warm necklace, not as an adornment, but as a kind of brand. The shock made her drop the box. She went back to her room and locked the door, but in the mirror she noticed that her features looked slightly different. Not glaringly so, but enough that anyone who knew her well would say, "You look like someone else." That night, as she lay in bed, she closed her eyes, and the sound of the piano returned. Not as a distant noise, but as music playing beside her bed. When she opened her eyes, no one was there, but the necklace chain was slightly displaced, as if invisible hands had adjusted it. And for the first time she didn't feel afraid, She felt like maybe she was ready for whatever coming back meant. That dawn there was no dream, there was experience. She was once again in the circular ballroom, but not as a visitor. She was a hostess. She wore the same silk dress that appeared in the photograph, and felt the weight of the necklace as if it were part of her own body. Music came from the piano, played by invisible hands, and indistinct voices filled the air, like a party filtered through memory. But something was wrong. Every face among the guests was blurred, as if the house didn't want to reveal who was there. She woke with her heart racing, still feeling the rough texture of her dress and the scent of wine in the air. When she got up, she noticed that the hem of her nightgown was slightly damp, as if it had dragged on the polished floor of the royal hall. Her necklace, warmer than ever, pulsed slowly but steadily, in a rhythm that was not unique to hers. At breakfast, the millionaire watched her longer than usual. He couldn't hide a brief smile when he noticed she was holding her cup, the same way the woman in the portrait did. "It's happening faster than I thought," he said, almost to himself. Mrs. Doyle looked away, but couldn't hide the tightness of her lips. That afternoon, while cleaning the library, his fingertips brushed a worn spine that seemed loose. As he pulled it, a narrow compartment opened, revealing a folded letter and a brooch shaped like the necklace's. Central Ruby. The letter was written in the same handwriting he'd seen before. "If anyone reads this, it's because the cycle has started again. Remember, you don't beat the house by obeying." The words burned into her mind. Later, alone in her room, she repeated the phrase quietly. And in that instant, the ruby seemed to react, heating and vibrating as if recognizing the sentence. That night, dinner was different. The table was set for 2, but there were 3 glasses. When she asked, he simply said, "It's for whoever arrives." She didn't have to wait long. The 3rd glass, untouched, slowly emptied, as if someone were drinking it. The ruby heated until it was almost unbearable, and in the reflection of the crystal, she saw, clearly, the face of the woman in the portrait, looking at her as if assessing whether her successor was ready. As she stood to leave, the millionaire grabbed her arm tightly enough to hold her in place. "You already know you can't leave, and soon you'll know why." He released her, but the touch lingered as if it were more than physical. That night, as she lay in bed, she felt the necklace tighten slightly, as if testing its resistance. As she closed her eyes, the woman's voice came clearly, for the first time without a whisper. "His end begins when you stop following the rules." The next night, the tension seemed palpable, as if the walls of the mansion were aware of her choice. Dinner proceeded as usual, candlelit, silence broken only by the clinking of cutlery, and his gaze fixed, calculated, measuring every gesture. But this time she didn't sit in the seat to his left. He chose the chair at the opposite end of the table, where none of the silent rules he imposed were enforced. The air changed density the instant he did. He watched her, his eyes narrowing slightly. He didn't say anything, but a muscle in his jaw twitched. Mrs. Doyle, serving the dish, hesitated in the movement, as if expecting him to explode, but the millionaire simply continued eating, as if the silence were a trap to make her retreat. She didn't flinch. Throughout dinner, she never took her eyes off him. She didn't touch her wine, didn't wait for his gestures to eat, and when she finished, she didn't wait for permission to get up. She left the room and, instead of returning to her room, walked down the hallway toward the east wing, alone. The double doors to the circular room stood open, as if prepared to welcome her. She entered, feeling the echo of her own footsteps and the warmth of the ruby. This time the room was not empty. The woman in the portrait was there, standing in the center, her silk dress billowing slightly as if there were a wind. She didn't speak, just watched her with intense eyes. The presence was too solid to be a ghost, but too ethereal to be flesh. She stepped into the circle on the floor and, for the first time, responded to the necklace's warmth not with fear, but with defiance. She touched the ruby, repeating the phrase from the letter she'd found in the library, "You don't win the house by obeying." The effect was immediate. The candles in the chandelier lit all at once, the sound of a piano filled the room, and in the reflection of one of the windows she saw not only herself and her wife, but also the millionaire standing pale in the doorway. He didn't enter. He simply said, in a low voice, "You don't know what this will cost." She took a step toward the female figure. The necklace burned, but it wasn't. Pain. It was as if it burned away everything that bound her. The woman reached out and touched her hand. An intense chill crept up her arm, and suddenly images began to flood her mind. Parties, pacts, promises. The first time the necklace was worn, the price paid by each successor. When the vision ceased, the woman spoke clearly for the first time. What he fears is not losing you, it's being left alone with his own reflection. When she left the room, the millionaire was no longer there. But the house silent seemed to breathe with her. The pact had been broken. The change began that very morning. The air in the mansion was colder, but it wasn't the physical chill coming from the walls or the wind. It was a chill that came from within, as if each room had lost something it had previously kept hidden. When she woke, she noticed that her necklace was loose around her neck, as if the chain had given up its hold. When she went down to breakfast, she found the dining room in disarray. Broken glasses on the floor, the linen tablecloth tossed aside, the chairs pushed abruptly apart. The millionaire sat at the head of the table, suitless, his eyes red from a seemingly endless vigil. He didn't look at her. He simply said, "You shouldn't have done that." Mrs. Doyle entered soon after, carrying a tray, but the expression on her face wasn't one of concern, it was one of quiet relief. As she served, she deliberately dropped a silver spoon at the young woman's feet. As she bent down to pick it up, she noticed a folded note hidden under her plate. "Go on, it's already breaking." The day was filled with strange signs. Doors, previously always opened or closed in a calculated manner, now moved on their own. Portraits were slightly askew, and the hall clock moved forward and backward by minutes as if it were breathing. Late in the afternoon, as she walked down the east wing hallway, she saw the millionaire standing before the door to the circular drawing room, but she didn't enter. She simply placed her hand against the wood and recoiled, as if something inside repelled her. That night dinner was unusually quiet, even by the standards of that house. Halfway through the meal, he said, "She's closer to you now. Can you feel it?" It wasn't a question, it was a statement. The warm ruby seemed to confirm it. In the early hours of the morning, the piano began again, but this time it wasn't a gentle melody. The notes were heavy, almost aggressive, and were accompanied by the sound of firm footsteps upstairs. Opening the bedroom door, she saw the woman in the portrait at the end of the hallway, motionless, staring directly at her. Her dress billowed as if the wind were only there. The figure raised his hand and pointed toward the stairs. Without hesitation, she followed. In the hall, she found Mrs. Doyle waiting with an antique key, which she placed in her palm. "It's for the office safe. What he fears is inside." Returning to his room, he couldn't sleep. He clutched the key tightly, feeling the ruby pulse in time with his own heart. And he knew with a cold certainty that from that moment on, there would be no going back. The next time he opened that iron door, everything would be over. The antique key felt heavier than its size warranted. The next morning she kept it hidden in her apron pocket, feeling the cold metal against her thigh every time she moved. The millionaire didn't show up for breakfast. Mrs. Doyle served in silence, but her eyes held a contained tension, as if expecting something to happen at any moment. When the young woman finished her meal, the housekeeper simply said, "He's in the garden. If you're going to do it now." The hallway to the office seemed longer. Each step echoed, and the necklace around her neck pulsed as if recognizing the direction she was heading. Once there, she closed the door behind her and knelt before the small iron door. The lock accepted the key without resistance, and the metallic sound of it turning was louder than any noise I had ever heard in that house. Upon opening it, he found the safe. Inside there was no gold or business documents, but a polished wooden box the size of a thick book. As he lifted it, he felt a strange, almost living warmth. He placed it on the table and opened it slowly. Inside was a dark leather-bound diary, the same one he had seen in the old photograph held by the woman in the portrait. She flipped through the pages, and each one seemed written for her. The diary wasn't just a life story. It was a meticulous record of each successor, each woman who had somehow worn the necklace. Stories of obedience, of fear, and always the same outcome, an abrupt departure or a disappearance. On the last completed page, written by Evelyn herself, was the sentence, "The next one must break the cycle. And to do that, it needs to see what he doesn't want to see." Beneath the diary was a yellowed envelope, handwritten with his name. The writing was identical to that of the old letters, but the date was recent, only 3 weeks old. He opened it carefully. The letter read, "You carry the blood. He carries the debt. Only one of you can leave this house free." The air grew heavy, and when she looked up, she saw the millionaire standing in the doorway, his gaze fixed on the open diary. "You don't know what you're doing," he said, but his voice no longer held the same command. The necklace grew warm around her neck, and the ruby glowed brightly, illuminating the dark leather. She closed the diary and held it to her chest. "I think I know exactly what I'm doing," she replied, her voice firm. As she left the office, she felt every wall of the mansion breathing with her, not to stop her, but to push her forward. "I knew the next night wouldn't be just another one. It would be the final adjustment." Night fell, laden with a silence that wasn't peace. It was the pause of an animal about to attack. The air grew denser, and every corner of the mansion seemed to watch. The hall clock struck 8, but its sound was deeper, as if a warning. She descended the stairs wearing the necklace, the ruby already warm, and Evelyn's diary clutched to her chest. In the dining room, the millionaire waited, impeccably dressed, but with a deep weariness in his eyes, like someone who knows the last card of the game has already been played. Mrs. Doyle poured the wine, but didn't sit. She stood in the doorway, a witness. He spoke first, his voice low but firm. "You think. You know, but you only know half. This necklace isn't just an inheritance, it's a prison, and whoever wears it also carries my story. That's how the house stays alive." She placed the diary open on the table, turning it so he could see the last page. "No, this is how you keep your lie alive." He glanced at Evelyn's writing and looked away like someone facing sunlight after years in the dark. The ruby began to pulse faster, and the room reacted. The candles flickered, the air grew colder, and the portrait on the wall seemed to lean forward by millimeters. The woman painted there, now more alive than ever, was not looking at her, but at him, and for a second, the entire room seemed to breathe in time with the painting. She lifted her hand to the necklace. The zipper, which had seemed unbreakable before, now came off easily. He held the ruby over his wineglass and said, without trembling, "Evelyn said you only break the cycle when someone looks at you. Look." He didn't look. The ruby glowed from within like embers, and she let a tear fall onto it. The impact made no sound, but a crack echoed off the painting, like wood giving way. Evelyn's face smiled for the first time, and at the same moment the millionaire staggered as if something had pulled his weight back. The floor creaked beneath his feet. A shadow projected behind him from the frame, growing until it embraced him around the waist. He tried to speak, but his voice faltered. The painting seemed to expand, gaining impossible depth, and the shadow pulled him inside with a sudden movement, leaving the chair empty and the wine wavering in the glass. The portrait now showed 2 figures, Evelyn, serene, and he, his expression hardened, trapped in the same golden frame. Her eyes held no hatred, they held the kind of justice that needs no words. The ruby, split in half, fell onto the table and cooled instantly. Mrs. Doyle entered, picked up the 2 halves, and placed them in the young woman's hand. "It's yours. Now, but not to wear, to keep." The next morning the mansion was different. The air was soft, the curtains opened to let in the sunlight, and there was no longer the invisible sound of footsteps or the echo of doors closing by themselves. The portrait remained on the wall, but if one looked closely, one could see that the figure's eyes no longer followed anyone. They were fixed on each other, eternally locked in that silent dialogue. She left the house at the same gate she'd almost left weeks before. Only now the gate wasn't a barrier. It was a real exit. In her pocket, the two halves of the ruby weighed heavy as a reminder and a warning. Deep down, she knew that this cycle couldn't repeat itself because the bond had been broken at just the right point, in the lie that sustained its power. As he walked down the road, Evelyn's voice rang clear in his mind, not as a whisper, but as a farewell. "Thank you for crying over me." And for the first time she answered aloud, for the house too. "Here, thank you for giving me back my true self." The gate closed behind her with a soft click. It wasn't prison, it was closure, and the mansion finally was at peace. If this story kept you hooked until the very last second, just imagine what's coming in the next video. Like now, subscribe and activate the bell, because the next story will show you that not every secret should be revealed.